and for coming tonight. It's really my honor and privilege to be moderating this session on the very important topic of what to do when community partnerships fall apart. And I want to thank all of you for coming, particularly at this very busy time of year. But I think the fact that you're here says something about the importance of the conversation that we're about to have. I want to say a special word of thanks to Jeff Oxendine and the Center for Public Health Practice. Had they not supported and underwritten this event, it couldn't have taken place. And also the Faculty Network on Community-Based Research, some of whose members are here and some on the panel. And this is a network of faculty around campus who believe deeply in this work. CalCore sponsors us, and we are also grateful to them for having put the word out. Events like this always require a lot of behind-the-scenes work and organization and planning, and I really want to thank both Jen Loy and Susana Morales Konishi. They did. And finally, none of us would be here tonight if it weren't for my dear friend and colleague, Len Syme, Professor Emeritus of Epidemiology and Community Health and Human Development, the father of social epidemiology, and just a giant in the field of public health. Len is a role model to thousands of people, not only around the country, but around the world. He is co-director with Linda, right behind there, Linda Newhouser of the Center for Health Research and Action, which does terrific work. But Len, as supportive as he is of community-based participatory research and partnerships, has become very concerned and lost a lot of sleep over the fact that so often they just don't work. And so he decided that it was time for his public, shall I say, private troubles to become public issues, or whatever the expression was. Anyway, he's the reason we're here. He wanted to get a conversation going. So Len, thank you for inviting us all into your area, your issue, and to allow us to share with you about this topic. Before I introduce our stellar panelists, I didn't even say hello to Malo yet, I want to say just a few words about the topic and how we see the evening as unfolding. Partnerships are defined by skeptics as unnatural acts between unconsenting adults. And I think we all know of that kind of partnership. It often happens when NIH or a foundation releases a request for proposals and they mandate that you have a partnership. So you scurry, I shouldn't say you, some people scurry around and try and get a few people together and say, don't worry, we won't bother you, we'll call you up a couple times a year. Those partnerships don't work, and they shouldn't, and we all know it. But we're talking tonight about the other kind of community partnership, the kind in which both partners, the community and the academic or other outside researcher, are deeply committed. They're committed to co-learning. They're committed to doing research together, to building capacity, and to using the findings of the work for action to try to improve health equity and social justice and community health and well-being. And yet, as we all know, even those well-meaning partnerships can fall on their face. And a lot of factors can contribute, certainly the fact that there are often big differentials in power and resources between the outside researchers and the communities. But we're focusing tonight on something that is much more difficult to talk about, and that is the elephant in the room, namely the changing demographics in communities and the very difficult power dynamics and related issues that can ensue for even the most committed partnerships. What does it mean when the census finally, after years of us cajoling them, agreed to put a whole bunch of new racial ethnic categories on the census form, including mixed race? And then people who are mixed race are pressured not to check that box because the disenfranchised group to which you belong needs to be able to show that they have more strength. What does it mean when we still, in 2011, cannot talk openly about racism and how that affects our work and everything we do in this society? We can't obviously do justice to these topics tonight. This is the beginning of a conversation. For many of us, it's the middle of a conversation that's going on for a while. But we do have other events. I want to mention just a couple of them. The Center for Public Health Practice does offer a wonderful workshop on the isms a couple times a year. It's going to be offered again June 6th. So if you're interested in that, please see Jeff or anyone else from the center. We also have a sign up and a lot of handouts on the Summer Institute on community-based participatory research that will also deal quite openly with race and racism and other issues that come up for partnerships. So tonight we just want to whet your appetite for this conversation, get into it as deeply as we can, and I think we have no better place to begin than with our panelists, so let me introduce them quickly. Victor Rubin has his doctorate from this, was it here? It was.
Couple rooms over.
It's a couple rooms over in City and Regional Planning, but it was in this building. And he is now Vice President of Research for PolicyLink in Oakland, one of my favorite organizations in the world. We asked Victor to come and set the stage with an overview of national demographic trends. And he's a perfect guy to do this. He's really a national leader in using new, innovative tools to make the case for equity and social justice. He leads PolicyLink's efforts to reframe the debate around infrastructure and transportation, but he also works on issues like overcrowded schools and water access and how land use planning affects health. And he's especially been involved in the work on rebuilding New Orleans after Katrina and on the impact of urban planning and the built environment on health. And he's a real interested partner and deep thinker about how community partnerships can be involved in all this work. And I've had the pleasure of working with him for a number of years and really admire him tremendously. I also have great admiration and friendship for Katrina Garçon, who has her MCP from this building as well. Katrina is a PhD candidate now in environmental science, policy, and management. And she's also co-director of a wonderful program at the Pacific Institute called Community Strategies and Sustainability, for Sustainability and Justice. And there'll be an article, lead author Priscilla Gonzalez, coming out in APHA. It'll be available online in May, about the work that Katrina and her colleagues do. She has very wide-ranging experience in multicultural leadership, popular education, policy advocacy, and CBPR. And I've had the privilege of watching her in action, doing trainings in West Oakland with different racial ethnic groups in the room. And Priscilla and Anna Lily, I think, also observed her. She just is a phenomenal leader in this way. We have asked both Katrina and Malo Hudson, who I'll introduce in a minute, to address two very difficult questions. First, how have demographic changes affected the ability of research partners to maintain genuine partnerships with these changing communities? And secondly, what can we do to deal with the frictions and the tensions that may occur? How can we salvage a partnership that perhaps has begun to unravel? But we also don't want to make tonight a total downer. So we wanted to be sure to invite Cheryl Walton, who got her MPH at the School of Public Health in the former Community Health Education program. Cheryl, like Katrina, is one of the most effective people I know in building alliances across bridges. Building alliances across differences. It's my sense of direction again. Okay. Anyway, she really helps create and sustain very diverse partnerships in the most effective possible way. She was a key architect of the Healthy Neighborhoods program in West Contra Costa, which I think is one of the most important examples of a good, solid partnership ever created. And she, as soon as she was, well, I think she was well into that partnership development in several different communities when she was stolen by the city of Berkeley and their health department to do the same thing here in Berkeley. She did it really, really well, so Alameda County stole her, where she worked out of the office of the director in creating such partnerships in East and West Oakland. And we wanted her on this panel partly because the exemplary work that she did in bringing together the Latino and African American communities in Sobrante Park in Oakland through a CBPR partnership And we want her to tell us about some of the positive things, the simple but important things she did that allowed those communities to come together in the way they did. And I know we also will hear positive examples from Katrina. Finally, Malo Andre Hudson is a rising star at UC Berkeley, got his doctorate from MIT in architecture and planning, and also did a RWJ postdoc at the University of Michigan. He is now an assistant professor here in city and regional planning, and his research focuses on community development, regional planning, urban sustainability, and population health. He's got a special interest in urban policy and politics, and especially the role of institutions in influencing urban and regional development. And during the last 2 years, Malo and some of his students have been working in both East Oakland and Richmond as part of California Endowment's Building Healthy Communities initiative, and I know he and Victor will both probably tell you more about that, but he is a widely sought after speaker on a number of topics, including community partnerships, so we're very lucky that you could join us today, Malo. Finally, we're going to end by giving, well, let me just say this. Each panelist is going to have 5 minutes for opening remarks. Then we'll give them 10 minutes to talk amongst themselves, as they say, and we will be able to listen in on that conversation. Then we'll open it up to all of you and really want you to join us in very frank and open discussion. And finally, we're leaving 10 minutes at the end for Len Syme to present his closing remarks. Okay, with that, let's turn to Victor.
We have a little sign on our microphones. They'd be 10 inches away from the microphone.
Yes.
And I know from various experience my hand is 9 inches long. I'm going to, from here to here, I'm going to do the best I can. It's good to be back in the building and with so many old friends. Cheryl was reminding me of a class I taught on community building 11 years ago here, where she was both a participant and, frankly, an expert guide doing the work that Mary was describing. A couple years before that, when Malo was an undergraduate, he worked in our community partnership with the City of Berkeley and City of Oakland. And most of what I know about CBPR and public policy I've learned from or with Mary and her colleagues. So this is very, very nice to be back with a lot of familiar faces and to make some new friends as well. I told Len that I didn't have quite as grim a story as the headline of this seminar suggested, but that I was certainly on board with the seriousness of the situation. What I'm going to do in these few minutes is mostly talk about changes in population, just to remind us of some things you may have heard of or maybe a few things that are new, and tease you with the several examples of community-driven or community-based research in neighborhoods of changing demographics that we at PolicyLink are involved in, but I won't have time to tell those stories in the 5 minutes, but I will tee them up in case they're of interest for the subsequent discussion, because I think these questions have very much hit home for us. PolicyLink is a national nonprofit research, action, and communications organization that works on issues of social and economic equity and questions of health equity and place and race and health are at the heart of everything we do. So this is all very timely. Like most people, we've been learning what we can from the new census findings, deeply frustrated by the changes in the census procedures that did away with the long form that tells you most of what researchers would want to know. Put in its place the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey does a 5-year rolling average of a lot of the detailed questions about income and where people work and more about their nationalities and many other things, but it has such small sample sizes and runs right now behind the census in a way that limits a lot of what we would like to know about changing neighborhoods. So we'll just take what we can from the new 2010 census and a couple of other interesting statistics and hope that they're on the right track. It's familiar news, of course, that the country will become so-called majority-minority by 2041 or so. Young people, people under 18, majority-minority by 2019 or as early as 2015, depending on what happens in the next few years. And that 92% of the population growth between 2000 and 2010 nationally was people of color. categories of which, as Meredith said, are continually changing. Not only is there that growth in places like Hawaii, New Mexico, California, and Texas that had traditionally been majority-minority, but there is a great expansion of Latino population in parts of the country where they had not been in large numbers, and a very large, now documented migration of African Americans back to southern states, and a whole lot of very interesting changes to metropolitan areas, small and large, all over the country. There's also a generation gap. Their difference in age among the races is tremendously large and probably greater than it's ever been. The average median age for Latinos in the country, I think, is now 27. For African Americans, it's a little over 30. For whites, it's in the mid-30s or even high 30s. Places where that generation gap is the highest, Phoenix, Arizona. In other words, the white population is significantly older than the population of people of color, people who are retired or people who are near retirement age with less connection to young people or to school systems or to a lot of the systems that need government support, often translate into very, very large differences between population numbers and voting age and voting results, and for a lot of the tension that we've seen both with regard to immigration but with regard to racial relations as well. Some of the 5 metros in the country with the largest cultural generation gap, the difference in age and race: Riverside, Tucson, Fresno, Bakersfield, Modesto. Retirement places, places with large farm worker populations. The issues we're going to talk about are true everywhere in the country, Las Vegas or anywhere else, but there are certain places where the trends are even more exacerbated. Nevada, speaking of Las Vegas, is now 1/4 Latino, the 5th most Latino state in the country, and a lot of that is new. People came for the construction and hospitality jobs and are now actually facing the worst economic downturn in the whole country. So whatever else is happening at the neighborhood level, there are tremendous economic pressures on the people in those neighborhoods of every race. 1 or 2 observations before I tell you about those cases, which I hope we can come back to. The trends in general are that I haven't mentioned yet, is that many neighborhoods formerly almost entirely African American are becoming increasingly mixed and increasingly Latino or Asian and Latino. We see there a lot of that right here in the Bay Area, but not only in the Bay Area. See poverty being increasingly suburbanized as poor and non-poor populations of African Americans and Latinos dispersed throughout the metropolitan areas. And in some areas, most of the immigrants to a region are living in the suburbs and not in the central cities. A lot of our images of what constitutes an immigrant neighborhood or a low-income neighborhood, a black neighborhood or a Latino neighborhood, are obsolete. Also, the immigrant communities and the refugee communities are not gateways they used to be, the way they used to be, because there was a lot more filtering and a lot more moving through when there was a lot more mobility in the economy. A place like San Antonio neighborhood in Oakland, or the Tenderloin in San Francisco, or Frogtown in St. Paul, Minnesota. These would have been areas you might have thought refugees or immigrants would come, stay 15, 20 years, and most of the communities would move on. But if there was no place to move because of high housing prices or lack of jobs that paid enough, those become more permanent homes for those communities. And that's a little different. And finally, important diversity within the black community, large numbers of African immigrants and Caribbean immigrants in many metropolitan areas of the country, so that our notion of a place like Brooklyn as an African American neighborhood, it's an African neighborhood, it's a Caribbean neighborhood, and it's an African American neighborhood. And those are increasingly important political differences and cultural differences. So with all that kind of change and mixing and changing of the location of low-income neighborhoods as well as combinations of race, it's not a surprise that the relationships and the power relationships in those communities get formed and reformed in that context. There are 3 places where we're working that I'll mention, and then we can come back to them in the discussion if people are interested. We've been doing these studies of food access, of the impact of a new supermarket on a low-income community. And we got started about 4 years ago, got support for community-based research where community groups like community health councils in LA or Southeast Food Access in Bayview were going to do and are doing the survey research with us. us being the Center for Weight and Health and Policy Link and Samuels and Associates. And these were traditionally black neighborhoods in South Central and in Bayview. And by the time we got on the ground in South Central, Superior, a Latino supermarket chain, had opened up in the middle of the neighborhood because they knew that the neighborhood was now predominantly Latino, which threw the study design out the window because we didn't even know they were coming. Community health councils adapted nicely, and we can talk about the relationships between the Latino merchants, the African American merchants, the black population, and the Latino population as they try to adjust to different ways of strategizing about food deserts. So it's not a crisis, but it's an absolute change of everybody's perceptions of what the neighborhood's like. And then the other place in St. Paul, Minnesota, University Avenue Corridor, sometimes known as Frogtown, or the Central Corridor, where a new light rail system is being built, we were going to do and did do community-based research about the impacts of this light rail system in this neighborhood that has the largest Hmong population in the country, a very large African-American population with the historic grievances of having the freeway plowed through the neighborhood 30, 40 years ago, and their vision of a light rail system is colored very much by that prior experience. One of the largest Somali populations in the same neighborhood, and a whole lot of white folks. I guess some of them are gentrifiers and some of them are grizzled old timers who've been there since the days of the lumberjacks. But that makes a neighborhood like that incredibly complicated in which to do research. And we thought we did have a good ally organization in the Hmong community. We were about to send them out to do surveys and then found out that the other Hmong organization in the neighborhood claimed that they should be doing this study and didn't want anything to do with cooperating with us. So again, not a crisis, but the kind of complexity that outsiders should never assume does not exist. But we can come back to those cases when we have some time, but the broader message is simply that the sense of neighborhoods being segregated to the point where almost everybody in a given neighborhood is of the same race is becoming less and less common. And the old patterns of how immigrant neighborhoods filter or how neighborhood change takes place seem to have to be reconsidered. And we can talk about some of the implications for research and frankly for the public health action that has to come forward as we go ahead. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Victor. Okay. Katrina?
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm recovering from a little throat thing, so just bear with me here. But I just wanted to really thank the organizers of this panel for creating a space for such an important dialogue. So I just wanted to start by saying I think the politics of representation is really at the heart, for me, of this question of shifting demographics. Who gets to define community, and how is that operationalized in the context of partnerships? And a lot of my personal understanding of what meaningful partnership is happens kind of through the environmental justice movement, where a key principle is we speak for ourselves. So for me, that means being mindful of the power and politics of representation whenever you find yourself speaking on behalf of others, whether that's the institution in which you are situated or the community that you are partnering with as a researcher. And so I think, for example, through participatory research lens, you might consider what does the data or findings from this research say about this community? How will this research speak about, for, or with the community? And to me, those questions are central to this notion of ownership of the research process and who who is the community that is claiming that ownership? How are we engaging? Who are we engaging? And how is that politics of engagement kind of give voice to particular segments of the community who may it alienate or exclude from that process? And this cuts across a range of axes of difference, whether that's gender, race and ethnicity, age, immigration status, livelihood, political kind of affiliation. It can be really broad-ranging. And so I think I wanted to say a little bit more about what I've learned just in my work at the Pacific Institute over the past 7 years, which is a nonprofit environmental research institute based out of Oakland, California, that has been, for about the past 15 years, really engaging with communities through community-engaged research. And this really came about because there were a group of researchers at the organization that, were looking over the freeway. We're in, downtown Oakland, over the 980 freeway, which is where kind of the boundaries of the West Oakland neighborhoods are delimited. And, thinking, how can we bring the tools of our institute to bear on local communities as well? And so this really happened through, for us, through the unfolding of our initial community partnership with, in West Oakland, which is called the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project. At the time, this happened in about 2000. This partnership started originally as a partnership between Pacific Institute and a community building initiative called the 7th Street McClymonds Initiative. And I think one of the first experiences we had to wrestle with these questions was kind of the dissolving of the community building initiative that we had partnered with a year or two into the partnership due to lack of funding and other factors. And so having to contend with this question of, okay, what are the structures for collaboration with the West Oakland community now that this institution is not here? And so for us, what we did was actually work with some of the community leaders we had engaged through the community building initiative and the initial outreach on this research project, and work to create a community coordinating committee, basically, structure for this project that would be a shared decision-making body between the community and the researchers, which was a co-chaired kind of committee that was co-chaired by two residents and then staff members of the Pacific Institute. And so this really kind of, we were in this odd position of kind of facilitating community participation in our own research project, essentially. We provided the staffing for this coordinating committee, which held monthly meetings in West Oakland. We worked with the community leadership, which was a range of folks that were either, non-affiliated with organizations or affiliated with organizations in the neighborhood, to develop kind of the agendas for these meetings, and to make sure that they captured key decision points in the research process. But we quickly ran up against this issue of, who in West Oakland actually is this coordinating committee representing? And at this time, that was kind of floated up from the process of identifying research issues, because one of the key issues people wanted to talk about was the affordability of housing in West Oakland. There was this kind of momentum underway around live-work, loft developments, redevelopment. West Oakland was being declared a redevelopment area, and a lot of the predominantly African-American leadership around environmental justice in the community was really concerned about gentrification and displacement. All the while, some of the folks that were getting really involved through this committee were the more recent white residents to the neighborhood that were really interested in finding a way of getting involved, and were cared also about these issues and were concerned about pollution in the neighborhood and taking collective action to address it. And so the co-chairship model became a way of engaging both of those groups, of those racial and ethnic groups. But the other kind of line of difference that became important was actually the line between resident and trucker, because one of the key issues that also arose out of this process that people wanted to work on was the issue of diesel truck traffic to and from the Port of Oakland through residential neighborhoods in West Oakland and the health impacts that was having on residents. And very quickly, the issue came up of, what about the truckers? Are you talking to the truckers? The community coordinating committee started to organize around this issue of wanting to create a new truck route to take the trucks out of residential neighborhoods. But the city public works department, the local council member raised, we're wondering, how are you, have you talked to the truckers? And so a key part of that process became building those relationships between the community residents and the independent truckers in the neighborhood who, as it turned out, were largely immigrant truckers that did not necessarily live in the neighborhood. Most of them didn't, but had a clear stake in this process around both the documenting diesel truck traffic impacts in the neighborhood and the solutions that would be developed out of that research, the policies that would directly affect their livelihoods. And so I think I kind of raised that example to say that sometimes it's more about creating the structure for people to have a dialogue about what are the key kind of leverage points in terms of building community, what are the key, who are the key people that need to be at the table that is the most important thing. Maybe it's not necessarily trying to predetermine it or guesstimate it based on a demographic profile of the neighborhood, but just really being willing to have those hard conversations about what it would mean. So through this process, the committee decided not to exclude truckers, even though it was at the time, it was a very challenging issue. Is this going to completely compromise our agenda around getting these community health impacts addressed? But as it has turned out, it actually really strengthened the work that the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project was able to do. And now they're now they are their own an independent nonprofit organization, but they're also a champion of trucker issues in the neighborhood. And they have a very nuanced understanding of the relationship between community health, worker health, and trucker community relationships and how to build and sustain those in a meaningful way. And so that's part of the collaborative model that they have built as an organization. And so I think to really build these meaningful collaborations, you have to be willing to go places outside of your comfort zone and build those alliances that initially seem really challenging to build. For example, knowing that gentrification is a tension in the neighborhood, how do you build those relationships between more recent people who have moved more recently to the neighborhood and people who have, been living for generations there, can trace their family roots, or people who are working there versus living there and may have different interests. And so I'll just leave you with some questions that we've thought about in trying to understand, who is represented in these institutions and these partnerships that institutions enter into. And we ask of ourselves as well as our community partners, how do you define the community that you represent? How do you work with this community to determine their organizational priorities and programs and have that guide your own work? Is there a membership structure in this organization? Who actually makes decisions about what the staff and members work on together? What are the structures of collaboration? What are the mechanisms for accountability and shared representation in decision making? And there's really no right answer to this question. There's no recipe of a type of community partner or type of research partner that would most meaningfully be able to collaborate together. But I think that these are important questions to talk about up front because they lay the groundwork for your partnership. And if you don't create the space to do that, it'll kind of come back to haunt you in the end in some shape or form. So.
Thank you. Wonderful. Cheryl.
Okay, is this 10? All right. Pants might be pretty big, though. All right. Thank you for inviting me, Mary and Lynn. I appreciate that. It's great to be here with some of my professors and those that I've admired and I look up to and read about. And then I take their work and I do my best to implement it in the communities. And so that's what I am. I'm a person who's on the ground, who really, I value the fact that I am a community person myself. I keep that in the front of my work. I do not bring my MPH to the table unless it's necessary in order to get some funding. But honest to God, when I'm in the community, I bring myself and my spirit and my honesty and my experience as an African-American person growing up in the Bay Area. And so that's what I'm going to share with you, that experience. So having worked, as Mary indicated, in the three largest, well, not largest, but I guess public health departments in the region, Contra Costa, City of Berkeley, and recently Alameda County, the model is that we've implemented, which I learned in Contra Costa, but have replicated in all three, which is to develop the survey tool, baseline survey tool with community, have them administer it along with staff in the community, door to door, teach them how to input the data into the computer, and have them help us to interpret the qualitative data, some of the questions that we may not understand. So they participate in the entire process in terms of the tool itself. And then I put together large community forums in the neighborhood and then have the community prioritize what particular issue that came out of the results that they want to work on. So that's basically the steps. So in Sobrante Park in Oakland, in East Oakland, I was hired by Arnold Perkins, who was the director of public health. And the first thing that Arnold said to me, and this is a key factor when trying to implement this in low-income communities of color, which have predominantly about 47% youth under the age of 24, and a lot of gangsters with the pants hanging out underneath their butts and hanging out on the corner selling drugs and what have you, and a lot of liquor stores and empty lots and parks that are not being used and auto body shops and industrial environment. And so you walk into all of this kind of stuff. So the main thing that Arnold said to me when I first came on board, he said, look, we work for the community. I'm hiring you to go out there, and I want you to have this lobby filled with people demanding that we give them what they want us to give them, period. Whatever it is, I know you can do this. So having that kind of leadership from the get-go, that's the first thing you have to have, somebody who gives you permission. And that happened, and who supports you all along. I was located in the office of the director, which gave it the weight it needed, and it let the staff know. And so the community-based participatory research we did came out of the public health department. So those were the researchers, and we worked sometimes in hand with UC Berkeley. So in Sobrante Park, basically, what we were to do was to implement population health, bridge relationships between Latinos and African Americans, implement community capacity building activities, and to reduce violence. So in Sobrante Park, the African Americans have been in this particular neighborhood. It's about maybe about almost 1,000 people in this particular neighborhood. It has one way in. It's on the other side of the railroad tracks, two sets of railroad tracks that border this particular community by 880 freeway and the airport. So it's immersed in the industrial neighborhood. It has one liquor store and 3 schools, a lot of resources, 3 schools in terms of schools, and but that's it. And the Habitat for Humanity was out there working in the community at the time, so that's the setting. So the African Americans were not welcoming the newcomers to the neighborhood, which were the Latinos, when I first started working there. There were about 50 some odd, about 60% African Americans back in 2005 when I started working there, and about 20 some odd percent Latinos. In about 3 years, that demographic changed. There were about 40 some odd percent Latinos. So with the growing number of Latinos, that's why we included the building relationships between Latinos and African Americans. The African Americans have been out there since the early 50s, and they remembered when in that neighborhood they had barbershops and shoe shine places and cleaners and a gas station and all these other kinds of amenities in the same little bitty neighborhood. So the elders had the history, and the youth who were now hanging out in the corners at these empty lots and what have you, and at the parks that were closed, had no idea that their neighborhood once was very vibrant and very active. And it was the one place where African Americans could live back in the 50s, because they all came here from the South in order to work in the shipyards and what have you. And this is the one place that African Americans could buy homes. So it's a lot of home ownership, tree-lined streets and what have you, with schools. So I come into this neighborhood, and I'm from Oakland, from East Oakland, and this is like 105th Avenue, and I'm at 110th. This is where I live. So I consider this my neighborhood, even though I don't actually live in it. And so I'm very familiar with it, which makes it a lot easier, because when you come in and you say, I'm from the neighborhood, I know exactly who you are and where you've been, and I've been here since that time as well. It makes it a lot easier to connect with the people. You can speak the language of the people, you know the rhythm of the neighborhood, you know the tone of the neighborhood. And so it's a different kind of welcoming experience. So when I got there, of course, I attended whatever community meetings that they were having, and I could feel the tension between the African Americans and the Latinos that were in the room. And I said, okay, how am I going to figure this thing out? So what I did was I held 2 different community forums to roll out the priorities, one for the Latinos and one for the African Americans. African Americans, of course, it was held in English. Latinos, I held it in all Spanish. And I invited the entire lead staff in the public health department to do the training. So I trained the public health staff in order to do the community forum in Sobrante Park. So that, you know, that's great. The deputy directors are now doing the trainings. That's a wonderful thing for the community. So that brought them to the community. Here they had never, were doing the work, they're investing in this, but they had never been to the community. Many of the staff were afraid to even walk into the community, because the first thing they saw was this park that's closed, one way in, one way out, a liquor store, folks hanging out, and they're there doing this community forum, okay? So that's another setting. So as time rolled on, Katrina happened. And when Katrina happened, I said, okay, this is a perfect opportunity. So when Katrina happened, I says, wonder if Katrina happened here in Sobrante Park. What would you do? Do you think the city of Oakland would respond to Sobrante Park in the same way they did in Louisiana, or do you think it would be different? And both groups said they would not respond to us. They would respond the same way they did in Louisiana to us over here in this part of Oakland. I said, well, do you see that this is an opportunity for you two to come together? And they said, yes, this is an opportunity. We could build upon each other's strengths. We need each other. So that brought them together, and we then I created the Resident Action Council for them to meet on a regular basis to roll out those priorities, which they ended up having the same top 3 priorities, except for the Latinos had one additional one, and that was they said that they wanted the police chief and his deputy to come out to the community in order to hear their complaints about how when they call 911, there's no one who answers the phone to be able to respond to them in Spanish. And that's ridiculous when they have issues around violence and crime. Somebody needs to be able to answer the phone. So, of course, we brought in the police chief and his deputies. He had about 6 different police officers that came along with him. And we had the meeting, and I brought in some translation equipment. We had simultaneous Spanish-English. So put the equipment on the police and let the Latinos conduct the meeting in Spanish, so that the police then and chief and the deputy would then understand what it feels like to be the one at a so-called disadvantage if you're not in control of the language that's being spoken in the room. And therefore, the police chief understood thoroughly what it felt like. And when he left, it took him 2 weeks to hire new staff to be at the 911 call for the Latino community for Sobrante Park. So that was another change that happened in terms of shifting power. And of course, you know, we asked those key questions, you know, because every so often we did a follow-up survey every 3 years to see how the Latinos and the African Americans felt and if they felt more empowered as a result of some of the creative things that we were doing in that neighborhood. Another example was every Christmas time, there's Kwanzaa, the African Americans do Kwanzaa celebrations, a cultural celebration. And the Latinos, what I learned, was doing posada. So they do the posadas and the African Americans do the Kwanzaas. I said, well, this is an opportunity for them to learn about each other's cultural celebrations. So every year in Sobrante Park, I created these little invitations. I was going to send you one to show it to you. It's half of it shows a posada, you know, the person with the posada, they're dressed in the thing with the candles and everything. And then the Kwanzaa. Send these out to all the community. Everybody gets about 300-400 people. Latinos and African Americans can't speak each other's language, but they're there. Everybody got on the equipment. Everybody has on the equipment, right? And we are learning about each other's culture, right? Because Kwanzaa is positive and Posada is positive. The next year, I can't think of the name, is it the Night of the Dead? The Day of the Dead. The Day of the Dead. The Day of the Dead, the next year, all of the African Americans were invited. And we marched within the community with the candles. And we marched, and you know, it's just a wonderful thing to be able to participate in each other's culture. And they ended up realizing they have so much in common. And therefore, I developed what is called a time bank. And the time bank is located at the church. And this is involved, the church is seen as a community center because there is no community center there. And the church, you know, the county provided about $50,000, and I said, okay, let's hold on to the money till the last minute, then we have to spend it. So then we spent it on investing in the church in order to upgrade the church, this room up there, and brought in all this equipment and what have you, and started the time bank. A time bank is 1 hour of your time doing something for someone earns you 1 credit of time that you could receive something from someone else. So I said, what a perfect tool in order to bridge these two communities. They can now share their strengths and talents with one another and be able to do things with one another without spending a dime. And all skills and talents are equal, so therefore it's not a barter system. That time bank today puts on, and this is where the Public Health Department just absolutely loves it because it becomes a co-productive model, because now the time bank puts on one of the largest health fairs in Oakland every year. And there's high levels of participation because all of the residents who participate in the time bank earn hours by putting on this health fair. Not only do they get a chance to bring in all of the programs from the Public Health Department in booths and get their blood pressure checks and screenings and what have you, right? All of the youth are participating as well, and everybody, they get tutoring. You know, what do they get back from the time bank? Something, they can go back to the time bank and get anything from taxes done to fence painted to plumbing or whatever, just for helping to put on this health fair. Well, all of this happens as a result of a lot of community capacity building that happened in the beginning. So the trainings that I provide, leadership trainings that I provide early on in the beginning of all of these, to implement all of these methods and strategies in order to bring community and Habitat for Humanity and the Public Health Department and the churches and the schools and the students and everybody into this particular community. The leadership training was 16 hours of leadership training in undoing racism, community organizing 101, asset mapping, regionalism. I had the elders, I had about 40 some odd youth and about 70 people in the training, 40 some odd youth. Well, I had the elders share with the youth after I had urban habitat come out and do this regionalism. And I had the elders share with the youth what the environment used to look like where they live now and what all they could do in order to bring that kind of business back. And that really empowered the youth. And some of the I call them knuckleheads, that were giving me a lot of difficulty. You're talking about culture. It's not just about race. It's also about our youth culture. That's a whole nother culture. And our elders. And them showing up, smelling like reeking of marijuana, and with their clothes half hanging off of them. I'm serious. How do you build that kind of relationship, that kind of partnership? How do you get your youth on board? It's not all about race. It's all about how do you bring and link all of these together? How do you get the kids to be quiet while the elders are speaking? What is that? What is that? How does that happen? I'm serious. And it happened. 16 hours with these groups together in one room. What does your activities look like? Well, your hands-on activities in order to keep everybody engaged and focused. Are there incentives? Do you pay stipends? What is it? So all of those things are important when designing and implementing these kinds of activities in communities where you want to keep them engaged. And to this day, I have to say, I'm really proud of the fact every project that I've ever rolled out is still existing. They're all sustaining themselves. And one key thing I need to say, I don't know what time I have, one key thing I need to say is, one thing I've learned somewhere in my notes is that you got to know when to pull out too. And that's one of the key things I want to talk about in our discussion, is that once the community is on their feet, let them stand. I don't think that a public health department or a researcher or anyone else needs to continue to hold on to them so they can milk them to continue their funding. You got to let them go and move on, because there are a whole lot of other communities in the county that could use the support. And one of the things I've learned about being in my role as a community organizer, I always work my way out of a job. That's the other thing. Because once you've done your work and they don't want to move on, then there's nowhere to go. So, I mean, there's a lot of factors to consider.
Okay. Let's have a hand for that panel. Okay. Oh, we didn't get to Malo yet. I'm sorry.
Well, you know what? I can, because of the time, I can just tell you a short story, and it won't take very long.
We'll squeeze the little, maybe we'll dispense with the panel talking amongst themselves, but we don't want to cut your...
Well, I'll be very brief. The story I'm going to tell you really is about politics, power, and economic development. And the leading actors was a powerful entity called Harvard University and all of Harvard's teaching hospitals. The other issues were changing demographics within the Boston communities of Jamaica Plain, Roxbury, Dorchester, and other surrounding communities. And it's a story about community organizations that were no longer really relevant to the changing demographics in the community, no longer relevant to the needs of the people who lived in those communities. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the Longwood Medical Area, it's about 230 plus acres right in the center of Boston. On any given day, they have roughly 40,000 people that go there, employees as well as students, and they bring in about $2 billion a year in research money. And right across the street from Harvard School of Public Health on Huntington Avenue, it was Mission Main Housing Developments. And in Mission Main Housing Developments, you had some of the same issues you would see in almost any community in the Global South: high infant mortality rates, HIV rates, violence, and everything else right across the street from the Harvard Medical School. I was very interested in this because as an economic developer, I was concerned that not only were hospitals hospitals and other medical facilities were major economic generators for cities, but what relationship do they have to the local community? So in the case of Boston, I started going to hospitals like Brigham and Women's Hospital. And if you go into the emergency room on any given day, go a Friday night, for instance, you would see roughly 90% of the people in there, immigrant, poor, and their first language was not English. And so I was very concerned about what the relationships were with all of this research that was going on, all of the studies that were being conducted, and if the only way they were engaging local communities was if you wrote the T, it would say, we need this either African-American male or Latino to be a subject in our study. And yet there was almost no engagement. And so you see this powerful entity doing world-class research and very good research, but having almost no interaction with the local community. So I started to figure out what was going on as part of my dissertation, and I came across an organization called Jamaica Plain Neighborhood Development Corporation. Jamaica Plain Neighborhood Development Corporation is had been in the community for a long time, in the community of Jamaica Plain in Boston, but they were concerned about how relevant they were. They were very conscious of the demographic changes that were happening, so for a long time they were serving an African-American community. And then with time, you started seeing Cape Verdeans move in, people from the Caribbean, and people from all over Latin America, as well as Asia, primarily Chinese and so forth. And they felt like they weren't providing the needs of what residents really wanted. So they had this strategic workshop, again, going back to sort of the issues of chasing the money and being able to get grants and whatnot. They wanted to be relevant. They had a workshop, and what came out of that workshop from all the groups that came were jobs, jobs, jobs. So Jamaica Plain Neighborhood Development Corporation approached the CEOs of the hospitals and said, well, you're growing, there's all this development happening, and you have people in the local community that not only have poor health status, but they also need access to real good quality jobs that provide benefits. Well, the hospitals, of course, said, oh, we're sympathetic to that issue, but we're in the business of running hospitals, and there's, we have a few programs, and we have a community benefits office, but that was pretty much as far as the conversation went. So being a good organization that they were, they started to organize. And they tried to find the common interest that everyone had, which was around jobs, economic development, the increasing cost of housing. So they went to the mayor, and like all mayors, they're concerned about being reelected. And so they went to Mayor Menino and said, Mayor Menino, you have this growing constituency in your city that are concerned about all these issues. And on the other hand, you have this Longwood medical area that has lots of jobs, and the hospitals don't necessarily pick up and go overseas. So they had a captive audience. The mayor was interested, but still not a whole lot happened. It wasn't really until Jamaica Plain Neighborhood Development Corporation started this campaign called Jobs for JP. And they really started just going around and trying to partner with unions, partner with other community organizations, whether it be organizations that worked with new immigrants or helping African Americans get jobs and so forth. So they cut across race, they cut across class, and they organized a strong constituency. And more importantly, they just didn't stop at the city level. They went to the state level, and they found a state representative who was also an immigrant, whose parents had came to that same community, who was very sympathetic to their cause, and said, well, I will work with you and support your cause. That put more pressure on the mayor. So the long story is this. The mayor met with hospital heads and said, look, I'm concerned about being, I wasn't at the conversation, but it went to something along these lines. I'm concerned about being reelected. You have all of these jobs right here in Boston. I'm concerned about the economic development of Boston. So I'm going to require you through the Boston Redevelopment Authority. So if you do any development, so if you're Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, if you're Children's Hospital, if you're Brigham and Women's, doesn't matter. If you're in this Longwood medical area and you're going to do any development, I'm going to require you to report on how many local Boston residents you hire, on what your community benefit programs are, and so forth. And what started to happen was, with BRA stepping in and imposing these requirements on the hospitals created a partnership called the Boston Healthcare Training Institute. And you had Sarah Griffin, who at the time was head of Jamaica Plain Neighborhood Development Corporation, was at the table with the CEOs designing this program. And so at one level, you had this huge power imbalance. But once the community organized, and not just in Jamaica Plain, but also in the Fenway neighborhood and also in Dorchester and Roxbury, you had hospitals that were willing to listen and sit down with community groups and actually figure out a program that might work for local residents. So I won't get into all the details, but I will say there are really 6 things that I've seen, not only through the work that I've done in Boston, but elsewhere around the country. One is the power imbalances, right? So these community partnerships often fall apart because of power imbalances. They're not inclusive. They're not inclusive along the lines of race and ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation, all the isms we can think of. There's a huge imbalance. In this case, Harvard had the power. The city, in many ways, had to step in. But the only reason why the city stepped in is because Jamaica Plain Neighborhood Development Neighborhood Association was able to organize and get people to the table. And initially, many of the community benefits efforts by the hospitals were not community-driven. And so oftentimes, organizations have to, or at least community organizations need to really focus on supporting local residents so that efforts are community-driven and not top-down, because those are oftentimes the most organic types of organizations or in effort and strategies and so forth. The third thing is there are weak partnerships among organizations. So some of the organizations in the early stages came together because there was money at the table, right? So you have things like the city paying attention to it. You had Rockefeller Foundation that was giving out money to support this effort. So people started to form partnerships, but these were weak partnerships. They weren't authentic. And what they really had to do was work through some of the differences in terms of what people's strategies were, what their long-term agendas were, their hidden agendas, but we can talk about that later. The fourth thing that's really important is community organizing. So Jamaica Plain Neighborhood Development Corporation was very good about organizing people across all the areas that I talked about earlier, and not only geographically, but among various demographic groups. And then the fifth thing is being innovative and flexible. And so oftentimes, we will start out in a particular initiative or effort, and we hit roadblocks, but you have to be very innovative and flexible in terms of your responses. So in the beginning, the hospitals weren't as receptive. They shut the door in the face of many community residents, but they didn't stop there. They formed partnerships with unions that were part of Harvard Medical School, or at least cleaned up Harvard Medical School and so forth, the janitorial services and whatnot. They formed partnerships with people at the state level, and they also tried to form partnerships with other similar groups in other states. So they were able to build this powerful entity that was very flexible and innovative. And then the last thing, number 6, is implementation. So oftentimes, you have to focus on the implementation. Good ideas are developed all the time, but if you can't implement it, then it doesn't amount for a whole lot. And so Jamaica Plain Neighborhood Development Corporation, all their partners, were really able to see that not only was this program created, but in future development, for instance, with the new hospital that just came on board, they were able to have a space for community residents to come in. They have a library for community residents. Physicians could give presentations on things like diabetes and so forth. And so there's some institutionalization of treating community members in a more humane manner than just being subjects, but actually being inclusive. And they developed a whole host of career ladders for people. So it's not like it was all a perfect program. I mean, some of the jobs pay better than what people were getting before. They provide benefits, but there's still a lot of work to do in terms of breaking down barriers. But the point is, they really focused on the implementation piece. So why don't I stop there and we can talk more.
Thank you. All right, now we can thank the panel. Okay. You guys have all done such a terrific job, but I think we want to hear from others in the room. So if you don't mind dispensing with the conversation among yourselves, let's hear from some of you, and then we'll leave Len his 10 minutes, and you're part of the room too, so feel free to jump in as well. Anybody want to start us off? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I have a microphone. Oh, Jen has a microphone. Okay. Anybody? Okay. Yeah.
I am Xochitl Castañeda, and I work here at the School of Public Health, but I have led one of the largest mobilization efforts throughout the country regarding immigrant health issues. And one of the key success of our experience that today has over 20,000 volunteers throughout the country is the partnership with the consulates and the partnership with the meaningful organizations for the immigrant communities in their places of origin, because that's something that is very important to understand, the strong links this community still has with the places of origin. So it's just an issue that I want to bring to the consideration of the panel, because I think it goes beyond culture, it goes beyond class, and it's related to the sense of belonging. And where's your sense of belonging for these immigrants that are sometimes considered aliens is a very strong issue to consider.
Great. Thank you. Anybody else? Oh, sorry.
I also want to thank the panel for sharing your wisdom and stories with us. And I'd like to ask a question of Cheryl. I was really struck by how inventive you were with getting the different communities together. And I'd love to hear just a little bit more about the turning point. You mentioned Katrina, but I wasn't quite sure how that event would bring together the African American and Latino communities. So maybe a little bit more about that turning point.
The turning point, like I said, we had just completed the community forums, and it was time to bring the groups together. We couldn't afford to keep them separate that way, so we needed to bring them together, and it just so happened Katrina happened. Katrina happened, where, as we all witnessed, how many witnessed Katrina? On television or something? Okay. Where there was thousands of African Americans who were displaced and not responded to by the local government, right? And by our country, period. And so it was a sad situation. And so in Sobrante Park, this is an isolated little neighborhood of people of color. And I didn't go into detail that the African Americans were not welcoming of the Latinos in this neighborhood. And the Latinos had shared with us, those who spoke English, that they thought that the African Americans were lazy and that they had been here in this country, they didn't want to work, and that they came here to work. And if they didn't want the jobs, they were going to take the jobs. So they had their perspective, and the African Americans were like, don't come here, we've been here since the 50s. So you had this level of animosity, and then you had a language barrier, okay? And they both had been trained in leadership. And so Katrina happened, and so I asked those two questions. What would you do if the city of Oakland responded in the same way that they did in New Orleans? And do you think you need each other in order to support one another should a disaster take place here? And they said yes, and therefore came together. It was just that simple. It wasn't simple, but it was just that simple. And the next month, they all, in Oakland, Sobrante Park, my little group of folk, it was 80 some odd number of them, they took Citizens of Oakland Respond to Emergencies, core training, the largest multi-ethnic group of residents who ever took disaster preparedness. Every year they do the mock disaster exercise with the city where they pretend that it's an emergency, and they run around and they now know where all the elders live and do they need wheelchair support or what their medications are. You should see them. The church is now the command center. They have, I mean, I can go on and on with the different kinds of examples. We've been very successful out there. And in terms of, I wanted to say one more about the time bank. Inside the church where they sit, I only bought one desk, but the Spanish-speaking person sits here and the English-speaking person sits here, and they have to try and communicate with each other. And that now they're both taking language, Spanish and English, so that they can now communicate. So,
Mahasen, is there a microphone?
I really enjoyed hearing all the panelists, and I guess perhaps Victor, you could comment on that. You talked about some of the changes and population demographics. And I was wondering, what is the data and what's your understanding of the fact that we are becoming more transient and how that really affects community capacity building? Because I would argue that some of the challenges in terms of building effective partnerships are sort of those individuals who have been in the community for some period of time, and then this younger generation that is very transient, and how you sort of build sort of collective efficacy among people who don't know each other, and sort of speak to that.
There are several different ways in which I think this is going to be increasingly important and increasingly different from what we're used to. And I haven't had the chance to learn about the Las Vegas example in detail, but a place that grows really quickly might mean that almost everybody is new. And it isn't a question like in St. Paul in Rondo, which is the oldest African-American neighborhood in Minnesota, and folks have been there for long before the 50s. The 50s is when the highway came through and knocked them out. They've been there since at least the 1920s, right? So they have a sense that each new group that comes in has come in at a different time. Maybe African-Americans have been there since the turn of the century, and the Hmong came in the 70s after the Vietnam War ended, and the Somalis came 10 years ago. So people have a sense of they're kind of layered in, but somebody set up a whole set of institutions before they got there, and the question is, do those institutions adapt and become multiracial or more than they were, or do people build coalitions and alliances and negotiate and build new groups? But there's that sense of history that pervades everything about the neighborhood. But I would imagine in a lot of places, inner ring suburbs whose populations have turned over tremendously in the last 10 or 20 years, and everybody there, whether they're black or Latino or Asian, has only been there 5, 10, 15 years, that is an entirely different organizing question. Mm-hmm. There's a professor at the University of Chicago, Scott Allard, in the Social Service Administration, who studies what happens in low-income suburbs, both with the social safety net and with the organizing. And he's, you know, you talk to community-based organization leaders there, and they feel very isolated. The foundations don't care about them. Mm-hmm. The governments are set up to ignore them. Transit system doesn't work for people who don't have cars, and they're even more isolated. And I think a whole lot of organizing strategy has to be rethought for neighborhoods that are transient. I think it's going to be a bigger and bigger issue. I mean, you just touched the surface of it.
If I just add to that, if you take the case of the Bay Area, I would agree with everything Victor said. If you look at the demographic changes that happened in the Bay Area because of economic changes that you've seen over the last 10, 20 years, many groups have moved from the inner core out to the suburbs and leaving behind their faith-based institutions, the community-based organizations that were there. So oftentimes you have the social service infrastructure that's back in the old city, but people have moved out to the suburban community. So in the case of the Bay Area, the data that's just come out that Oakland has lost about 25% of its black population. There's a great study that Urban Strategies Council did looking at San Francisco and other cities in the urban core and where people are now. And basically, it's the same story. People have left, but their institutions, whether it be even your barber or your hairdresser, that sort of thing, or your social networks, a lot of that has changed now. And the social service organizations, community-based organizations, have not been able to adjust to those changes as rapidly as they've happened. And now you're looking at a case in the Bay Area, the Brentwoods, the Antiochs, and other places like that are going bankrupt or have huge financial problems, and the infrastructure is falling apart precisely at a time gas prices are about to be $5 a gallon. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean for community? Mm-hmm. What does that mean for the sustainability at a time when people, oftentimes, whether it be in Bayview, Hunters Point, or other parts of Oakland, sold their homes, right, at the height of the market, 2005, many people sold their homes because they said, well, since the Naval Shipyard closed back in the 1970s, no one really cared about us. And now that we're the only area where you can develop, now you care about us. So land speculators came in early on, paid cash for people's homes. They sold, and then they lost all that in the housing market.
There's a nice example that I have right in front of me here that bears on your question, too. The USC Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration with Manuel Pastor and Dow Myers and others, and my colleague Jennifer Tran, who we just stole from there, did a study at the request of the Second Baptist Church, one of the oldest churches in South LA. It had become what we call a regional commuter church. Many, probably most of the original parishioners had moved away. They still go back for church, or they go back for Sunday afternoon dinner, or they go back to get their hair cut, but they don't live in the community anymore. Community in South LA becomes increasingly Latino. The church went out of its way to commission a study of what had changed in the neighborhood and how they could remain relevant, even though the neighborhood's becoming mostly Latino and they're an African-American church. And I have a link to this study here on this sheet that we printed out if you want to learn a little more about it. But I think that's one positive example of, in the old days it used to be, well, the Italian church was Catholic, say in North Oakland and Temescal or something. The Catholic Church was Italian, and then it becomes Latino. What's the relationship of the old parishioners to the new ones? There's kind of a different version of that that's happening in its own way in places like Los Angeles.
In places like Sobrante Park, now the one church there is sharing the church with having both services for Latinos and for African Americans.
Good example. We've got a couple more comments, and then I do want to leave time for Len. So. Okay.
I just wanted to thank the panel for today. I'm a second-year HSB student, and I had a question for Cheryl. When you were working with the Resident Action Council and just you yourself, we talk a lot in Mary's class about the insider-outsider kind of dynamic. And so I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the challenges and how you overcame that personally and also with some of the leaders that were involved.
Okay. I guess my strategy is, a lot of times people want you to talk to the stakeholders first, that's how they say that, go talk to the stakeholders. I'm the one that goes to those people who are least likely to participate first, and then I go to the stakeholders. Yeah, I go to those kids hanging out on the corner. I go to the grandmother who might show up at the liquor store to get some soap powder, and I just engage her in conversation and tell them that I'm going to have a community meeting or what have you, or what we're getting ready to do in Sobrante Park, and who should I talk to in order to engage more other people. I talk to the youth, and I accept them for who they are. Like we always say, meet them where they are. And I do provide incentives for our youth so that they will find that it's worthy of their time to come. And once I get them engaged, once you got the kids, you got the kids. Mm-hmm. And then I just pick them up and I take the kids with me to work, and they shadow me for about 2 years. And they hang out in Arnold Perkins' office, and they have on T-shirts that say, "I got the blow." And he then tells them, "You can't come up in here looking like that." And so we parent their kids, and we teach them. And then I go to the stakeholders. It takes me about a good 6 months before I go to those who think they know everything because they've lived out there forever. But I think the success that I've had in the community comes from engaging those who are least likely to participate.
Great. Okay.
So they give me this and told me how to turn it on. I have to wait until it comes on. The 3-second rule. All right. Yeah. This goes back to something that Mr. Rubin said, and then Malo also. When you're dealing with ethnic enclaves and there's a transition, should we be, in our community-based research, looking to see about how to avoid enclaves? One of the things that I had learned when I was younger is that we should be looking to avoid segregation, and we should be looking to try to have some sort of desegregation type activities going on and getting people to work together. And that's where your project seems to be the most active and has gotten groups from 2 ethnicities to work together. And what I'm trying to find when I do my community-based research is what is the, how would you put it? What's the touchstone that makes people believe, yes, we can all work together no matter who we are, and it's not about our ethnicity or where we started, it's about where we're at now here in the neighborhood, wherever they've chosen.
Mm-hmm.
The organizations whose work I admire are using the research as a small part of a much larger agenda. So the research is not, in most cases, going to either define their lives or be the main driving force. But if you look at a group like the Community Coalition in South LA, or the Jacobs Center for Neighborhood Innovation in Southeast San Diego, they make a conscious effort to develop a program that is responsive to the needs of their members of different backgrounds, different races. They have very different approaches from each other, but they don't try to pretend the differences don't exist and just say we all have a common agenda or a common enemy or a common mission. They actually spend time working on what those cultural and ethnic issues are and work through them and build a stronger organization as a result. And they're each very interesting in that way, and they're deliberately multiracial and multicultural. And they each do a lot of research and partner with researchers on their own terms. But the research isn't the driving thing. But I think it's the framework that the institution's leaders have, which in most of these situations of powerful organizations or effective organizations. And I think in St. Paul there were all kinds of organizations, some of which were members of one race only because they were organized around ethnic lines. And there it's a question of, can they build a big coalition to have a common policy agenda, in this case about what the new light rail system would look like. And there they're more negotiating with each other. They come together to create a coalition. The coalition commissions some research on its terms, and it has ministers of all faiths and secular leaders of all backgrounds. But I think they have to work that out first. I haven't seen anybody trying to talk about it as being segregation or enclaves, because there's a fair amount of mutual respect to start with, or they won't get anywhere. I don't know if you want.
Well, in my work, this comes up, this is a great question. In my own work and what I teach, you have to understand if these are forced. Is it forced segregation versus voluntary? And anytime you see ethnic enclaves, it's important to understand what's the function of that enclave. Oftentimes, if you're someone on the outside, it might seem like segregation, but if you actually go in and see what's going on, you'll find out it's about upward mobility, it's about preserving culture, language, the historical things that people care about from their own backgrounds, and also going back to the first comment that we had, which I thought was an excellent comment, about these transnational identities and having ties back to the homeland, if you will. And if you think about economic globalization and everything that's happening, for the young people, this is an opportunity to move forward. It's something to embrace. And it's ironic that in our country right now, there's so much xenophobia around different ethnic groups and ethnic enclaves, and what we really should do is embrace it. You see it here at a place like Berkeley, an international university, where people have different experiences, and they might have grown up one way, but once they come to the university, or certainly even back in the ethnic enclave, dealing with various groups, they're able to have these dialogues. It's not always a pretty story, but they're able to have these dialogues. But more importantly, they have ties back home. And that oftentimes is great in many ways in terms of spreading democracy, talking about democracy, challenging some of Americans' assumptions and whatnot. So I think it's the future. If you look at all our metropolitan areas, the largest ones are obviously becoming majority-minority. Global capital is going everywhere. And I think when we're thinking about the complex problems that we have in our society, it's going to take all types of people to solve those problems. Yeah. And that's really the global community. So I think I'm very hopeful about the future, especially among our young people, because they have such a different perspective than we did growing up.
They do. That's a great note on which to turn to Len for the last word.
Hey, Len. It's me, Maria. I had a question for this group. Can I still ask it? Is that all right? I'm Maria Hernandez. I'm one of his sidekicks. And I happen to have worked in both the community environment as well as the corporate environment. My clients include East Palo Alto Chief of Police and the Mayor, and Procter & Gamble. And one of the executives at Procter & Gamble is often introducing his presentation about the importance of diversity by saying, more salsa is sold in the United States every day than ketchup. So where's the business community? In what you all have described, where's the business community?
I can speak a little bit to that. I think part of the West Oakland Environmental Indicators process that I was talking about earlier was one of the hard points of how do we engage the local business owners. Clearly they have a lot to say about these issues. They're concerned that these policies we're interested in are going to undermine their efforts to grow their businesses. And so the West Oakland Commerce Association actually became a key part of the process. And it was really interesting to watch, the dynamics at some of these committee meetings where it was very, a contentious kind of conversations, and oftentimes the perspectives or opinions would be at odds with each other from the Commerce Association folks and some of the environmental justice kind of leadership about some of the key issues. For example, even with the issue of diesel trucks moving in and out of the community, they're like, well, those are the trucks that service our businesses. We need to get our goods in and out of this neighborhood. So we need to account for that when we're thinking about rerouting trucks through the neighborhood. What are the implications of designating a new truck route on local businesses? And so, I think that is also a really key part of building this, creating a space. And I definitely agree with what Cheryl said earlier, is that, you have to broaden the spectrum of the dialogue so that it includes the unusual suspects. And yes, that may mean your agenda may shift, but that's part of what's implicit in this process, is that you're willing to relinquish control in some way over where the agenda is going to head, and really trust that this is going to be a democratic dialogue, and we'll see where it shakes out. And we're all going to put our cards on the table to some extent and say, these are our priorities, and this is why these are the positions of interest in which we're engaging in this process. And so I think that is pivotal, especially in a lot of these communities. It's not part of the thing that people are trying to challenge is this, thinking about livelihood or jobs versus health, or livelihoods versus environmental well-being. And they're like, we want to breathe clean air, but we need jobs too. And we need to work together to figure out how to make that happen in this neighborhood. And that can't happen without creating the kinds of institutions of collaboration that really bring people together to hash those things out. How is this going to look on the ground? And what does this mean for the policies, solutions that we're proposing as a community, which is, both business owners and grandmothers with grandchildren with asthma that they're taking care of, and people who are, have relatives that are truckers or, are truckers themselves and want to protect their livelihoods.
Right. Wonderful.
Okay. I had a whole thing, but let me just come to the bottom line. It seems to me what we're talking about is the issue of how to deal with the problem of community organizations when they're no longer relevant to the people living in that community. And it sounded to me like what's needed is a crisis. It needs Boston CEOs being confronted by the mayor. It needs planning for a new railway system. It needs a Katrina-like crisis where a police chief is confronted with Spanish-speaking people. And some sort of crisis so that people can come to realize that they have more in common than they have in differences, and that the best way to deal with a crisis is by coming together. Anyway, it seems to me that this is one of the most difficult challenges we face, and it's central to the success in public health. We can't proceed without it, so I hope we can continue this conversation. Mm-hmm. And it's fabulous what you guys are saying. This has been an amazing experience for me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you. I echo Len. Thank you all. And thanks